Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us. We're going to call the meeting to order. We actually have every committee member in attendance because Marianne is joining us from Austria, I think, by Zoom. Thank you, Marianne. Nice to see you. We also have landscape architect Bernard Trainer in the audience here, who I hope will be actively participating, or might be making you come up closer at some point. We'll see. So we have a lot to do today. We had an enormous number of documents. We had maybe 190 some pages of things to go through. My guess is we will not get through it today. And I am going to propose that we at least foreground the stuff that we have Marianne here for, which is primarily the landscape item. So if it's okay with my colleagues, I think, and you please tell me, I'd like to put announcements lower down, and maybe we'll take public comment on non-agenda items, but then move right to the landscape aspect. Is that all right with the rest of you all? Yes. I see nods. Okay. Terrific. All right, so let's start with public comment on anything that's not on the agenda today. If anyone has any thoughts that they want to express at the mic in the room, we'll start there. I don't see any movement, really. Carol, you want to come up?
I just had Carol Hall. I just had a question about Nori Winter's submission of the design guidelines and whether you've seen them and whether they've come in and what the status of that is.
That's a good question. That's actually item 5, but we probably...
Oh, it is?
Yes, because it's update on consultant and staff work products.
Okay.
However, I don't know if you want to quickly answer, or should we leave it?
If it's an agenda item, we should wait.
Okay, we'll wait. Sorry, Carol.
Thank you.
Okay. And then I see a fair number of folks on the screen here. Does anyone from the Zoom room have any thoughts on items not on the agenda? I'm giving it a few seconds for unmuting. I'm not seeing anything.
Nope, I think
Okay.
you're okay
All right.
to move ahead.
So we're moving ahead. I asked Brandon to just sort of introduce for the public, and there's a fair number of people here, and for us, just the kind of overview of the documents we were given and kind of the roles of things. So thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So yeah, as you pointed out at the beginning, we did send out a large number of documents, already existing documents, to the group ahead of time. We made those available online for the public as well. The purpose of those documents was to inform today's conversation, and I'm going to go up a level. So if everyone recalls, in recent times, the City Council directed staff to find a landscape consultant, bring a contract back to City Council for approval to work on a landscape ordinance that essentially dovetails with the design guidelines work that we're doing here in the steering committee. So the landscape ordinance lives outside of the design guidelines. It's a separate project, but there are overlap areas with design guidelines, obviously. It's one of the things we as a committee and the public have identified very early on, that the landscaping on that sort of like front part of a property is really important to making sure that houses aren't presenting themselves, as we've sort of said at this body, like naked or open to the street. So we've been charged with developing an updated landscape ordinance, and that's important to note that that's updating because the city actually has a landscape ordinance. That was one of the attachments that's on there. In our zoning code, we have chapter 17.34, which is effectively what we're going to be updating with the city's consultant. So we do plan on being at City Council next week to talk about that contract. And so what you got was a series of documents that were intended to show all the areas that exist right now in the code and policy documents that speak to landscaping. It included treatment of the right-of-way, it included a vision statement, and so the goal of having those documents in everyone's hands about a week ago was so that you can provide some guidance on how you see a landscaping ordinance best interplaying with the design guidelines that this body is charged with working on. So that's really what we're here for today. And I did pass out some questions to you that are on the dais. Those will hopefully help guide the conversation. So we'll take a look at those here in a minute. But they really help guide what I think what we really need to get from the steering committee today is, which is based on what you've heard from the community over the last 8 months, what would landscape ordinance accomplish, or what should it accomplish? What are we trying to do with this thing? How should the landscape ordinance interact with the design guidelines that we're working on in this committee? For example, right now the design guidelines have a section on landscaping. Does that need to effectively just get a little bit smaller and be more policy statements and then directly refer someone out to the landscaping policy documents, the landscape ordinance and everything that comes out of that? What's the interaction? How does that actually work for someone? Because one of the goals of this project was to try to make the design review process simple for everyone, simple and understandable. And then what does a successful landscape ordinance look like immediately, 1 year, 5 years into perpetuity? Meaning, what is it going to do? What does it look like? Is it going to be an evolving document? Just trying to think about the future of that. So those documents, like I said, they're existing documents, and hopefully they'll help guide the conversation today. They're really more of a reference.
And Brandon, just to add to that a little bit, for folks who didn't get a chance to sift through the 90-some pages, what Brandon gave us was, as he said, the copy of the existing chapter of the zoning code that's called landscaping, 17.34, something called trees and shrubs, which is 17.48, the overall 17.10 R1 district design regulations, and then a chapter 12.08 encroachments. These are all parts of our zoning code. Mm-hmm. We also have in our possession some of the, which everyone has and has access to publicly, the design guideline chapters that focus on landscaping items, and then also this thing called the right-of-way vision statement, which I had never seen before, which you might say a word or two about how that's been used.
It's a document. It was created before I was here. It's a document that, like our Public Works Department uses. It was adopted by the City Council as a means to sort of like a mission statement for how we treat our right-of-way. And so it does interplay with all those. And some of those documents, thank you for naming them, some of those documents that were included, like the R1 design guidelines section, that has a bunch of other stuff in it too. And so I tried, for that one specifically, I tried to highlight just the very few sections that speak to landscaping. Mm-hmm. So we're not really looking for feedback on the rest of that section because that's different and aside. We're really just talking about landscaping. So I tried to highlight those. But encroachments, there's talk about how we treat the right of way. Mm-hmm. Trees and shrubs, even though they're technically landscaping to an extent, they were put in their own chapter at one point in the zoning code. So that's another conversation we're going to be having with our landscape consultant. Does that make sense to keep doing it that way? And so we're looking for feedback at that level from the committee as well. Do you think that makes sense to you to have a landscaping section of an ordinance and then a whole nother chapter that talks about trees and shrubs, which are also plants?
And then I would just follow up a little bit as a framing thought, and then we're going to go to public comment, that Brandon and I and Brandon and the rest of the group have had conversations over the last several months about the role of the documents in general, and our charge, I think, through this year-long exercise of trying to make them as accessible as possible, as user-friendly as possible. The exercise that we probably won't get to today, and the one we did as a group, the meeting before last, have all aimed at trying to almost think of these documents, which have always been rich with useful material, but how do we make them more user-friendly? In other words, where are the gateways where you arrive to town? What's the first thing you learn? How obvious is it to go to the next thing that you need to learn? And really, even though we're fortunate to have this very disciplined staff that is on top of teaching folks how to present their ideas for their projects, et cetera, and enforcing things and requiring folks, as Brandon says, to show their work and ground their decisions in these documents. What we really need is to create a culture of a love for these principles. And the culture has to infuse through the town, for new people that come to the town, even if Brandon and his entire staff is airlifted to Paris to help something from some fabulous project there. So again, thinking about this as an overview of public access. And in the last several weeks, we've, as a group anyway, proposed the notion that these 6 principles will be maybe the first thing that you encounter, because 6 is a small number. And then maybe we branch out from there. So again, there's a lot to absorb here, 90 to 100 pages of stuff. But we need to focus on how it all fits together and what are the big kind of guideposts for people.
And I think, Madam Chair, if I could make one more statement. So setting the task at hand aside, I do want to recognize that we have the team from Ground Studios here today. They are not currently under contract with the City of Carmel-by-the-Sea, but we are working on that right now.
Perfect.
And so they're here more in a listening capacity. They don't have a presentation prepared. We didn't ask them to do that, obviously. We can have some conversations with them, but for me and for our prospective consultant, the most important thing to get out today is the feedback from you all as a steering committee. What do you feel is most important to accomplish in a landscape ordinance? So we can certainly tap them as a resource for questions if we need to, but they're not here for any sort of presentation or anything like that.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's perfect. Okay. So I'm going to take it out to the public on this topic of landscape ordinance, and then I also want to just preview that I want to hear from Mary Ann before she has to go. I don't know what her schedule is over there, but we're very lucky that she was able to phone in, and I have no idea what time it is where you are, Mary Ann, but I hope you're awake. We did receive a letter from someone that we just are seeing today. I think that's you, David, yeah? So I know there's at least this topic in the public, and so let's open it up to public comment on this issue. Anyone in the room that wants to come up to the mic?
Good morning. I'm David O'Neill. Thank you, everyone, for your service. I'm here today on behalf of the Carmel Preservation Association. I'm a local resident, I'm a homeowner, and I'm also a real estate investor here. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that actually show up in these documents, just a few little things. Now, they may not directly relate only to landscape, but they're in these documents. So the first one is under the landscape item, chapter 17.10, R1 District Design Regulations PDF. Under the R1 District Design Regulations, we've got letter D. It talks about mass and bulk. Residential design shall maintain Carmel's enduring principles of modesty and simplicity and preserve the city's traditional simple homes as amidst of the forest landscape. So that is modified by us to take out the verbiage of simplicity. The reason why I'm bringing this up in particular is because we have something that at the last Planning Commission meeting, we had an example of using the simplicity as an issue that curtailed design. I know it's not landscaping, but it's here in this landscaping.
David, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but if it isn't about landscaping...
It's in the documents that were presented to us.
I know, but you know what? I think what Brandon just... And it's not that I'm trying to cut you off. There will be a time when we can discuss that topic at another meeting. But Brandon just explained that some of the stuff, and I know it's misleading, that he kept in the packet is actually just peripheral to landscaping. It just happens to be in the same document.
Okay,
so
then
I
I'll
thought
go to
maybe
the
there
next...
was something about landscaping you wanted to say.
Well, it's in the documents. It's under the landscaping documents. So you're putting this material in both design guidelines and in the landscape documents. So if you're going to have them in both places, we have to discuss them at both times. Are you going to tell me when we're talking about the other, I can't talk about this?
No, I'm just saying I don't think that any of this is actually in the landscaping documents. Because I'm just seeing this for the first time, so I'm trying to.
So
help.
what this is, if I could. So what we sent out were the R1 design regulations, the entire chapter of the R1 design regulations, and the landscaping stuff was highlighted in there. So yes, this section does fit in there, but this is really more adjacent to our conversations that we've had about bulk plane and mass, and things like that. So we're going to talk more about this stuff as we continue along. There'll be I do agree with the chair. I mean, I just don't think this is that germane to the landscaping conversation. We're here to find out what the community and what the steering committee think about a landscape ordinance and how that should interplay with the design guidelines. So
Okay, understood.
Yeah.
I do have something else to talk about the landscaping.
Okay, great.
The last sentence in that paragraph reads, "The use of natural materials such as wood and stone and the creative use of landscaping can also help to avoid excess mass by introducing texture, variety, and screening." The first issue about this is that landscaping is not permanent. It can die, it can be replaced. And we believe that it is not appropriate to hide architecture that is not within the design guidelines by landscaping that is. So we would ask that that be removed.
I think you're right. That is a landscaping point, David. Thank you so much. Perfect.
Okay, that'll be it for today.
Perfect. Thank
Thanks.
you. Sorry, we will come back to everything. Seriously.
Okay.
Don't worry about that.
I
one.
understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Anyone else on a landscaping issue from the public?
Nancy Toomey here. Good morning, and thank you for all of what you're doing. In the right-of-way vision statement, which I just now saw, it kind of calls out in most neighborhoods. And I would argue that some of the points made here also applies to the downtown area. Having it continue to look rustic and not highly structured with regard to pavement, curbs, sidewalks, the encasement of where we put landscaping needs to have that kind of rocky and again rustic kind of look and feel. So I love this statement. I just would like to see it expand to incorporate some of the downtown area as well.
Nancy, could you just point to where you saw what you are referring to?
So it's this
the
document.
right-of-way
This
vision
document.
statement.
It just
Got
starts
it.
out by saying
In most neighborhoods.
In most
Got it.
neighborhoods.
Got it.
And so I think it's all neighborhoods and downtown would
Got
be
it.
what I would propose.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask Brandon, where did that mission statement come from? There's no date on it. I can't stand things that aren't dated.
yeah, I know. I'm with you, Dawn. I have no idea when this was adopted.
It's a mystery.
Victoria and I talked about this the other day because this is just something that exists in the city documents long before I was here. I haven't been able to track down when it was adopted either. So I agree with you. It should have a date on the bottom. That would be helpful. Yeah, Madam Chair, I think if I could maybe try distilling what Nancy just said, which is such a good comment, is that whatever landscaping we do, trying to bring this to the question we're trying to answer, what should the landscape ordinance do? It sounds like her comment is more about the landscaping ordinance should also contemplate the commercial areas. And I think we're on that track already.
Good.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from the room? And then I'm going to go to the Zoom room. I don't see anyone with a hand up or anything. Okay, anyone on the electronic room that would have any comments about this major agenda item today? Landscape. Oh, Neil. I see Neil hand up. Go ahead.
Just want to reiterate from the early comments in the city council going back some months, the city council began to say, it was repeated twice by two city commissioners, that, well, we don't really feel that architectural design is, architectural styles are an issue as long as the landscape and the setting will mitigate whatever that design style is. I want to compliment you on a statement that is included, I believe, in the current documents, but such use of landscaping should not substitute for good building design. Thank you for that. So I wanted to reiterate that we see the landscaping has been used as a way to mitigate this issue of architectural design styles. And with the CPA, we want to remind you that styles that have these big monolithic walls and are based on geometry and are cold and unfeeling and so on and so forth, that we don't want landscaping in any way to be used as an excuse or a lever arm to make it possible to do some design styles that may or may not be compatible with the Carmel Village forest character. Thank you.
Point well taken. Thank you, Neil. Anyone else from the Zoom room? I see Jason with his hand up. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you, committee members. My name is Jason Rederer. I'm an attorney with JRG Attorneys at Law. I do a lot of land use work around the county and city of Carmel. One of the sections, section 5 of the site planning guidelines of the design guidelines, addresses privacy, views, light, and air. And one of the objectives is to balance view opportunities to natural features and landscapes. Specifically, there's a policy P1-65, that states the city should consider the effect of proposed residential construction on privacy, solar access, and private views of neighbors. However, one component that is missing from the guidelines and the landscape guidelines is any consideration of the effect of proposed landscaping on solar access and private views. I just wanted to point out that I think this is an important component for the committee to consider. I get a lot of calls as an attorney from owners in Carmel who are concerned about view impacts, and I've been involved in spite fence cases that some of you may be aware of. I think coming up with some guidelines and standards for landscaping within significant view sheds of neighboring properties would go a long way to try to minimize those kinds of disputes that I deal with. And that's my comment. I appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I haven't heard that one yet this year, and so I'm duly noted. Anyone else from the Zoom room? Looking around, not seeing anything. Okay, this is a big chance. I just want to sell it one more time. Okay, all right. So now, guess who's on the spot next, Marianne?
Ladies and gentlemen, Marianne Chickatans.
Marianne, have you gotten it? I would love for you, because we're always afraid of losing you, if you could just give us your general thoughts. You heard Brandon's questions, you heard my framing of our responsibility to guide folks independently, self-sufficiently into this culture of caring about the forest and optimizing our landscaping. What are your thoughts, Marianne?
Well, first, thank you for putting all that material together, because that is so incredibly helpful to get prepared. So I speed read through that this afternoon. And it was really good to read everything at once, because usually you don't, even when you get prepared for a hearing, you don't do that. And so what became clear is that, it's way too fragmented, I think, our references to landscape art. But also it's clear that a lot of things that we said we wanted to accomplish are actually there. They are just in so many different places. How much was actually there.
Marianne, can I interrupt you? I don't know if everyone else is having the trouble, but I don't know if your microphone is close enough to you, or it's on our end. Brandon, what do you think? I'm fine.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, try getting closer to your microphone and see what happens.
It's
okay. Is this better?
The volume is low.
Yeah,
I think it's part of the issue.
It could just be
the international waters.
I do not have a very good connection. Let me wander into a different location.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's a fun little architectural tour of the inside of this building.
What I said was
arched doorway.
So this is the best spot I have, so I'm not sure if this is better.
Okay, so I'll just ask you, and sorry for the imposition, but to just speak as loudly as you can. I mean, don't scream, don't wake anyone up, but just as loudly as you can. Thank you.
As I can. So what I said is that I read through the material and that I found that what we are looking for, a lot of that is already there, but it is in so many different places that it is, I think, almost impossible to administer for the staff, or even for people working in town. It will be very hard to find all the different places where trees and shrubs and landscaping and sidewalls and pavement and exterior lighting is addressed in. So I think to answer Brandon's question, what would be the purpose of the landscape ordinance? I think the purpose would be to take all of those references that we have and address it in one document, and that one document should have equal weight to the architectural design guidelines. The other thing I noticed is that there is inconsistency in these documents. So I think that would be addressed by making it one document. I also believe, then there's all the fine points, like the fact that there are references, and they're also different, for that only some of the landscaping should be native. There are different numbers, I think, for what's supposed to be native on the parcel versus in the right-of-way. And one thing that we wanted to address is the continuity of the landscape is something I think we had identified to be is important. And that would be another change to what is currently on the books.
Did you say, sorry to back up real quick, again, we're having a little bit of audio issue, but did you say something, first I heard you say that there's an issue of just the scatteredness of the information and everything should be in one document. Did you also say something about incompleteness? Is that the word you used?
Inconsistency.
Say it again?
Inconsistency.
Inconsistency.
So like internal,
Inconsistency.
so like where maybe, I
Sorry.
know what she's talking about. There's some like conflicting language between the various sections in there. So that's one thing we're as staff excited about combining them. If, I think that's where we're going to go with this, but that's why we're having this conversation, is maybe it's a good idea to shove them all in together into one thing, so we don't have those inconsistencies.
Okay, sorry, I just couldn't hear that word. It's my fault. Keep going, Marianne, sorry.
I turned off my video because I thought maybe it's a bandwidth issue, and then you can hear me better this way.
I can't hear.
It's just a volume thing, but go ahead, Marianne. Just speak as loud as you can.
Yeah, as loud as you can. And I think it actually is better with you live on the screen, so we can at least see your expressions and your mouth moving. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Breathe.
And
Yeah,
we're
we're
recording this too.
Yeah.
We're recording this, so we can always go back and play it at staff level if we miss something.
Okay.
Okay, and then I think what Mr. Rederer addressed is something that some thought should be given to. With all this solar mandate that we have right now from the state, and we like to encourage the higher tree canopy. At least I think we should have this as a discussion point, how we deal with it. One can get an exemption when applying for new buildings from that solar ordinance, but it's still important, I think, to weigh in what the goals of the city would be in regard to the solar ordinance. But to cycle back to the native landscape or not native landscape, I think that should really be cleaned up and should be much stricter, because why would we not want to have all native landscape, especially in the public right away?
I am going to have me and others at this dais try to actually quickly summarize what we think you said. You mentioned, in general, it's too disorganized, and you correct me, Marianne, if I'm getting any of this wrong, that there are a number of issues that need to be brought together. For example, the exterior lighting was one that you said you'd like to see one document. You said there was inconsistency. You clarified that. You said that sometimes there are places where it seems to call out that this applies only to some of the landscaping. That point was made earlier by someone in the public. Maybe it should be more comprehensive than that. You said, you mentioned that we have this, over the year, discussed a continuity of landscape from the middle of the street all the way back into the private lots, and that needs to be addressed better. I think you just were bringing up this state mandate that I'm probably not aware of about solar access, maybe having to do with power, and that needs to be brought up, and that kind of integrated, and that kind of dovetails with what that attorney said about, for different reasons, about actually how foliage affects neighbors. And then you brought up the native, non-native debate and making sure that's a topic for us to resolve. Did I miss anything, Marianne?
No,
Madam Chair, I
didn't,
caught.
but,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Marianne.
I really want to reiterate the continuity, because I think that having a residential and a commercial, these different landscape guidelines makes no sense to me. Landscape should, the whole point is that we want a continuous landscape.
Okay.
One thing I did hear Marianne say is that that whatever landscape regulations we come up with should have an equal weight to the architectural
Yes.
guidelines
Yeah.
in landscape.
Okay, good. Okay, it's like reading the tea leaves over here.
Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, I'm just continuing to note down. Okay, thank you, Marion. Please don't go anywhere. We're just gonna use that as a launching pad and take it back to the dais here. Who's next? Don?
Well, I'll be happy to speak up just to second everything Marianne was saying. I read the entirety of all of our present landscape things. It is so diffuse and so repetitive and so vague. It's just impossible, in my view. I think we need a concise statement, and indeed all the things you, Victoria, have talked about, of highlighting what are the principles we're after, rather than just a lot of bureaucratic, extensive comments.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that adds something to Marianne's, I would argue, which is the vagueness of the language is something you're bringing up, which Marianne didn't mention, and I agree with that as well. So I'm going to start with Doug on my far other side.
Just general comment?
Yeah, just general, just like Marianne, anything along those lines.
Back in the early 1960s, there was a longtime planning commissioner in Carmel, may have gone on to the city council, named Florence Jocelyn. And Florence's standard comment was, planning is planting. And I think the documents we have extend that spirit down through the time of Carmel. But it looks like it's the application of the standards is where we have a problem. As an example, in the right-of-way statement, it says paving, gravel, boulders, etc. are prohibited. But there is a house that was remodeled on Santa Lucia on the south side. That gravel was put in the front yard, and it's still there years later, even after some complaints are filed. So it's the application of what we already have. The spirit of what we want is already on the documents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, so.
And you know, I was just listening to a podcast. There's no way that a law can be comprehensive enough, obviously, to cover every minute of every individual life of every human on the planet. That's not how the law works. Right. We're doing a regulatory exercise here. So this goes back to the question of not only can the law not do that, but a staff cannot do it. Mm-hmm. So how do you infuse these values into our culture better? The document is not doing it. The documents, plural, are not doing it. And even the documents plus a staff cannot do that. So we need to just do our best to figure out the strategies for that.
One of the things I've noticed throughout the years, I mean, Doug's totally right, is that documents where they're spread out all over the place, regulatory documents spread out all over the place, are much harder to use as an enforcement tool.
Sure.
It's even when you're in the midst of reviewing a proposed project. That means you have 3 documents to look at versus 1, and you're more likely as a human being to miss something. So I think that might be another tick in the box for combining it into one thing.
And I've mentioned before that most of the standards apply to private properties, except for this right-of-way statement, but it only applies, as Nancy pointed out, to residential material. Look at the difference between Dolores Street north of Ocean up to the post office, where there's a tree canopy, and south of Ocean, where there's very few trees. Now, part of that is because of utility lines under the sidewalk, but there are other alternatives. We have a bulb-out planter at Piccadilly Park. Other cities have large planters they put in their sidewalks. Downtown Portland, Seattle have large planters because they have underground utilities and can't put street trees into the soil. So we have other options. It's almost like we need a streetscape plan for the streets and to strengthen the public public right-of-way standards and requirements.
You know, and that kind of, we'll ask Marianne to weigh in on this too, but it kind of reminds me of perhaps why we have the hopefully the role of Bernard Traynor and his folks here, which is, I think, part, and Marianne will correct me if I'm wrong, of her original thinking was kind of along these lines, which is almost an illustrated vision of what the end point would look like in a way, or what is the actual vision, maybe even graphically, that we are headed towards, so that each property does reinforce that, and also the public property reinforces that. I think that's why it's very good to have a landscape architect who is a designer is part of the mix, because it is also a physical thing we're trying to correct, and so it's a subtle point you're making, Doug, in a certain way, but we cannot lose that. I think there's something there that goes beyond regulation in a way. So I'm starring that. Okay, Doug, you have anything else before I go to Melanie? Okay, Melanie.
I tend to agree with everything that previous speakers have said. I think that in reading all of this, I think the weakest part of all of it, from my point of view, is the design guidelines. The design guidelines need to be totally rewritten as it relates to landscaping. I think it's very poorly done, and I think that a lot of what's in the ordinances and so forth really hits everything, as a couple of people have mentioned, hits everything that we want to accomplish. But the fragmented state of everything, and then the lack of carrying through what's in the ordinances and policies and even programs is not really reflected in a strong, definitive way in the design guidelines. The design guidelines are going to be extremely important in all of this. I found myself rewriting the thing instead of just glossing through it and getting an impression. I found myself trying to rewrite the guidelines that are in existence. So I think what we really need to do is synthesize everything and almost use bullet points. The major points we have headings, and then we have bullet points, because people can respond to bullet points. When you get too much verbiage like we've got here, I mean, that's why the staff, I think, and the Planning Commission don't really respond. I'll just say it this way: respond to what's in the documents and what's including the design guidelines, because it's just scattered all over the place. And if we proceed with doing large policy statements, but then we hit the bullet points of exactly what we want everyone to pay attention to, then I think it's going to be a document that's more easily enforced. And like we've mentioned, our checklist, well, it kind of coordinates with the concept of a checklist. And I think we'll get much more adherence, much greater enforcement if we do that. There's just too much verbiage in all of these pages. Some of it's really outstanding, and then some of it's totally unnecessary and too vague. So, I mean, those are my comments. I agree with Nancy about why the right-of-way vision statement doesn't include the commercial area is beyond me. But and then I don't think that the right-of-way statement talks enough about trees. I mean, that should be the first thing that's there. And I totally agree with the fact that, in certain parts of town, and this is also an enforcement issue, certain parts of town, the trees are a canopy. And then when you start cutting down the trees, we don't see replacement trees. This is current, and it has happened for the last number of years. Trees are not replaced. And there's a very clear statement in there that the trees are supposed to be replaced. There are several places. Trees are supposed to be replaced almost immediately or right after they're cut down. And if you don't do that, you lose track of them. That's why we've got so many trees that have been cut down more recently, and we don't have replacement plantings. And replacement plantings of a decent size that they can last for 5 years. That's what's required.
Can I respond to that for one quick second and ask Brandon, where is that part? I think I saw it in all this, but where is that part in our vast regulations about what the cities or maybe private owners, like what that protocol is? Something comes down, you do this. Every time a tree comes down, you plant two.
I would imagine it's in the tree and shrub ordinance, but there's also, now we're tipping a little bit into more of a forest management plan type of thing too,
That's
which is
what I was wondering.
Which is what the Public Works is under contract right now with Davy Tree Services, Land Use Services for rewriting the city's forest management plan. So the landscaping ordinance will obviously be aware of that and where necessary reference to that. But we're talking now like the bigger canopy trees stuff.
So where is that forest management plan in the greater scheme of our documents for my benefit and everybody else's?
That's a document that's housed in Public Works. It should be available on their website.
Is it like underneath another canopy of regulations?
So what it gets you, so if you think about the way that our process works here, so we've got the Forest and Beach Commission. The Forest Management Plan is basically their design guidelines document, if you will, akin to like the Planning Commission, right? So the Forest Management Plan is what the Forester and Public Works and the Forest and Beach Commission use for the technical regulation of trees.
And how do you, Brandon, see that relating to this conversation today?
Well, I think it's a good question because if you want to get really wacky about it, all the documents in the city, in one way or another, should interplay with each other. Like they need to be aware. Like the section that talks about how we pave streets, at least needs to be aware of the fact that there's trees in the village. And the section that talks about trees need to be aware of the fact that there's houses in the village. So it's all related. So the way that I see this going is when we really dig into writing the landscape section, we will find appropriate areas, like we're doing with the design guidelines, to link and say, once you get to this part, or if this is a concern, you're going to want to go check out this document. So that's how I see those interplaying with each other.
Yeah, I need to go look at that again, I think, the forest management, if I've ever seen it. May I?
Sure.
Do you have more other thoughts?
No, not really. I can pass on. Go ahead.
I was just thinking of circling back to Marianne now that she's heard everybody weigh in from the dais. Marianne, do you have any comments on what has been said so far from this room?
It was all pretty consistent that
I can't hear her.
Can't hear.
about the
Sorry.
fragmentation and how big the need for one document is, and I think it should include the forest management plan document. So I do think that the landscape should not be fragmented either into trees and shrubs and other landscaping. I think it's all one landscape that should be addressed in one document.
Repeat what she said.
I think
So what I heard her say was
ahead.
that she was agreeing with the continued sentiment that it's very fragmented, and what I heard at the end there was that it shouldn't be broken into a tree and shrub section and a landscape section. It should all be part of a landscape regulatory document. Is that a fair recap, Marianne?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so.
Madam Chair, could I ask a
Yes, go
question?
ahead.
Because it kind of dovetails, or springboards, I suppose, off of what Melanie was talking about. So one of the questions that I put forward that we're going to be talking about with the consultant is, from a practical perspective, how much should we leave in the design guidelines? So the design traditions, design guidelines document that has bulk plane, colors, materials, all that stuff. There is a section right now that Melanie was talking about that speaks to landscaping, and it's maybe not as well written as it should be or it needs to be. So the question is, one of the things we're wrestling with, and that's why I put it on here, is do we want to try to accomplish landscaping goals in those design guidelines? Or do we just want to have a couple of bigger statements that basically say in as many pretty words as you want, landscaping is really important. Now go look at this thing that we've created that is the landscape Bible, basically. So that's one of the pieces of feedback I'm hoping from this commission, or this committee, is how would you practically see that, with knowing that our overarching goal is to make these new design guidelines as user-friendly as possible for the public, developers, and staff, and decision makers, so that they're a good regulatory tool. Do you see building more into the guidelines that we have right now, really cutting it down so it just points to the landscape guidelines that we're developing? I'm really curious what you all think.
I'm really curious what we all think too, and I have and I'm starting, as you're speaking, Brandon, I'm thinking of what Doug said about what do you call it, a streetscape plan. Mm-hmm. And I kind of thought maybe try this on for size. Maybe the first of all, back up. I think we have to think of a neophyte coming to town and think of where are the entry points to learn our culture and embrace and love our culture for our love of place. And I think, like I said earlier, that these 6 principles feel really simple and really a good way to enter in. Then the question, I think, is what's the next document? And maybe it's the design guidelines just because they're so attractive and they're so well illustrated. So, and will be even better illustrated. So I think a regulatory document is a little more boring, a little bit more black and white. That part's good, actually, I think, for in general. But it maybe it's a little more. It's just less illustrated, and so perhaps we would conceive, and this is not at all a proposal. I'm just thinking this is one idea is you have the 6 principles. They dive you into the design guidelines, and the design guidelines immediately push you out to the proper regulations, and therefore the design guidelines might be less verbose, but they would still have all the visual stuff that helps people understand the language. And then that would be where this streetscape plan might come into play. I don't know. But maybe the thought is this is the user-friendly, the whole document is the user-friendly next gateway to all the other regulations. That, I don't know that answers the question of how much stuff should be in the landscaping thing, but what it does answer is something should be there. In other words, you wouldn't say to the design guidelines, okay, we have 6 principles. For principle number 1, see this other document. You would say, no, there's something to see here, but then we refer you also to the regulatory one holistic document that Marianne is talking about, which I think from her comments would certainly push us toward taking the pieces that you gave us from the zoning code and trying to combine them into one section about landscaping. But what is everybody's thought about? You've arrived at the 6 principles. They've introduced you to the guidelines. How does what's the function of the landscape part of the guidelines? And where does it steer you from there?
Well, I'm thinking of it in a broader context. Mm-hmm. The general plan's organized into goals, objectives, and policies. Yes. You know, and maybe that's how we structure this, is what are our goals, and then what are the policies to get there? And the policies would basically be enunciated in the regulations. You know, I think I hadn't realized it before, but we have all these different sections of the code that essentially deal with the same subject matter. Right. And now we have a forest management plan that's being redone. So
right.
It seems we can consolidate some of this, have some guiding principles, and then branch off from that into regulatory documents.
So it sounds like that's a vote, if you're answering Brandon's question, for the guidelines to be at a higher level of principles. And then the nitty-gritty, so it could be like principles, regulatory framework in the regulations and then back to the guidelines for examples, for illustrations. Maybe that's the role they play, but we are always ensuring that the folks who read the guidelines are aware that really the thing they need to be looking at is a much more clarified, consolidated, beautifully reconciled regulatory framework.
So let me throw this at you. So,
Yes.
it sounds like we've heard, and I just saw Marianne raise her hand. I'll be quick, Marianne.
Oh, good.
What I've heard over and over is that we've got fragmented landscape designs. So I'm wondering if one option would be to just have those high-level principles in the design guidelines document, and then whatever examples, if it's an illustrative, 4 or 5 pages, that lives in the zoning code with the actual regulations, so that the regulatory piece and the example piece are all together. You don't have to go back and forth between the two.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we really want to just hit somebody over the head with it and say, this is what it is, you don't have to go anywhere else, one-stop shopping for landscape stuff, maybe we don't want to split them.
Well, I will only say, and then Marianne, I'll take it out to you. If we're going to give landscaping and structures equal treatment, then I think they have to be all handled the same way. Whatever we decide for landscaping, we should say that's going to be the template we follow for building, so people don't get confused about that. Oh, if I'm talking about trees, I need to go this way. If I'm thinking about, my fence, I need to go this way or whatever. So just want to throw that out there, that we have, when we propose whatever this approach is, it has to be able to follow through in terms of consistency. Okay, Marianne, you apparently had your hand up. Did you? Yes.
I Sue had her hand up too, in case you didn't see that I was in crowd. But just from, I didn't quite follow you, I want to say, but in regards to Brandon's question, I would take everything landscape out of the design guidelines from here and just create a reference to the new landscape ordinance, and everything outside that's not a building, whether it's site walls, fences, pavement treatments, exterior lighting, plants, trees, all live in the landscape ordinance.
Right. I mean, what we could be,
Can I restate that for everybody? In case
Yes,
they didn't hear?
please,
Okay.
Brandon.
So, Marianne, I'm going to say what I think I heard you said, and you give us a thumbs up, because I was listening really intently. So it sounds like you're trying to answer the question of, how should they work? And you basically said, take everything that's landscaping related out of the design guidelines, just with some references. That includes the landscaping, things that aren't houses and structures. So you're talking like fencing, hardscapes, pathways, things like that, that would all live sort of in a landscaping treatment ordinance package.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Visuals are good. So I see a hand up, but we're not at public comment yet. I'm not sure. So if I could just hold on that for a moment. So realize what that implies. That we could be talking, and I'm not adverse to considering this, we could be talking about the design guidelines in general becoming a reference that points to the zoning code, period, for everything. That's what we could be saying. If we are giving landscaping the same treatment as the rest of our purview here, then the design guidelines become pointers to regulations. All of them. That's one way to look at it. Because otherwise we're saying, look here for landscape, look there for everything else. And that's a type of confusion we don't want.
Right.
I don't disagree with Marianne's suggestion at all. I'm just saying the implication is, what if you follow through on our 6 principles and everything is pointing you to regulations? Then what is the role of the design guidelines? And maybe they disappear. And it's all just zoning. So this is a question I would love reactions to.
But is the forest management plan part of the zoning code, Brandon?
No.
So, and is there a reason that couldn't be incorporated?
Into the zoning code?
Uh-huh.
I suppose there's never, I don't want to speak too much to the forest management plan because it's kind of out of my purview, being a public works document. There's always a way to do things, I guess, to answer that question. If the city wanted to somehow push the forest management plan into the zoning code, there's always a way to do that.
Because if we don't, then it's all bifurcated again. It starts to be scattered.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, though, I mean,
might be
everything is somewhat interrelated. I mean, that's how a municipal code works, right? You have chapters all within a municipal code. So in that way, they are connected to each other. If you push everything into a zoning code, you just have a municipal code in one chapter, basically.
Right. Well, let's stay for a moment on this point of the role of the design guidelines. If we're saying that at least for landscaping, we want to consider having the first principle, which is about preserving and enhancing the forest, just point you toward the new and improved and consolidated landscape ordinance that we haven't come up with yet. What do you all think is the role for the design guidelines? If that were a principle that followed through for the design guidelines in general, what is the best role for the design guidelines? This is a very strange conversation to be having right now, but I think it's important. Should the Planning Commission just be looking at regulations instead of a design guideline document?
No.
May I?
Yes, Marianne.
If the new landscape, maybe you call it landscape ordinance, but maybe what this is called is landscape guidelines, the same as the design guidelines for the build structures. Those would live on equal footings, and then there is the implementation of it that also lives on equal footings.
So I'm not sure, are you proposing in that moment that the idea of a landscape ordinance really could just be a landscape guideline, a part of the guidelines, basically? Are you saying it could be either place, either in the zoning code or in the guidelines?
I think we need both. We need design guidelines for the buildings, and we need landscape design guidelines. And we need an ordinance for the building, and we need a landscape ordinance.
Okay.
Because everything should function the same.
Okay, so what goes in the guidelines versus what goes in the ordinance, in your opinion? What type of information is contained in each of those two places?
It should be structured the same as the building design guidelines.
No, I'm talking about the other cross direction. So if you're looking at the guidelines versus the regulations, let's just stick to landscaping right for a second. What's the difference between the information in those two places?
What is the difference right now in the buildings between the ordinance and the design guidelines?
That's a very good question. I think there's a lot of repetition. This is what people have been observing today. I would argue that the difference is about examples, illustrations, and possibly accessibility in terms of
Usability.
yeah, I would think of it as maybe the reverse of how we've been thinking of it. Like, ideally, the regulations are so super clear, both for the new landscape ordinance and all its comprehensive, unification of these pieces. Similarly, at some point, that would be the case in the zoning code for the built environment. But in the design guidelines, we see examples, how to do it, how to plug in and understand it better, how to think about it, visualize it. I think that does create a distinguishing quality to the two documents. Or you could always say it all just eventually ends up in the zoning code, and you don't ever have to cross-reference. But if we're talking about what is the role of having two documents, to me that is, as long as the regulations are clear and bullet pointy and unwavering and no shalls and shoulds, then the design guidelines can help people interpret and look around and become a kind of visual.
Yeah.
I read what they said. What did they really mean?
Yeah, you know, Madam Chair, I just saw Nori unmute himself and put his
good.
face in the screen. So maybe if you want to let him talk a little bit
I would
about
love
the
that.
difference between the design
I
guideline and
didn't
the
see
zoning
you,
code.
Nori. Please, Nori, we're very conceptual here now.
Good morning. Generally speaking, the distinction between the code and the guidelines are the code is prescriptive. They are measurable standards, or they are black and white. You either meet it or you don't. And they can be administered by staff. And you must meet all of them. There isn't any discretion in them. That's normally the way a zoning code works. Design guidelines and the design review process that is set up by the city is a bit more discretionary. And generally, you do want to avoid putting prescriptive standards in the guidelines, although sometimes they do show up there. But they are more qualitative, talking about the overall effect of something and meeting the intent. And in this case, the intent is set forth in those basic principles. So I think they both have a role, as Marianne is suggesting. What is important is to move things out of the guidelines as they become codified. Right now, there is material in the guidelines draft that is there because it isn't necessarily anyplace else right now, and we want to acknowledge it because we've heard the community expressing concerns about certain things. Victoria is correct. The other role is that it visualizes how do you meet the intent. These are different, and it can express the range of variety that the code doesn't necessarily express. If you move all of that into the code, you can certainly illustrate it much more than it is now to help clarify the intent and how things are interpreted in terms of determining absolute compliance that the code requires. So this is sort of a universal view generally about how the two tools work together. And I don't know if that helps with your discussion, but do keep in mind that city has established a design review process that involves the community and the planning commission, and in some cases potentially another advisory board that compliance with the zoning code doesn't necessarily involve. That's it.
Thank you, Nori. That's very clear.
If I may add something,
Yes.
the only way I am familiar with this whole concept is from working on the coast, where we have a coastal act and a coastal plan, and we have the implementation plan, which was updated many times. And I think in that very same way, these two documents would relate to each other.
So what Marianne just said, I'm being the Marianne whisperer today.
Yes.
Especially because I used to work at the county. So the county, they have coastal plans, they have a general plan, and then they have implementation plans. So the implementation plan is effectively your zoning code. The coastal plan is basically your design guidelines, although there is some regulatory stuff in there. So what she's talking about is there's two documents, just like with our design guidelines and our zoning code, that set up the higher sort of principles, like Nori was talking about, the stuff that's kind of discretionary. You need to weigh and measure against each other as a general philosophy or purpose, and then you have the implementation of the zoning code that's the 16 feet tall, 4 feet from the setback, these kind of things that are measurable and quantifiable.
Not to throw a wrench in it, but I wonder if one of the ways we could be more clear with ourselves in this community and make these documents really relate to one another is, we've been talking about these very simple short list of 6 big principles that we hope people can memorize and just sort of carry around with them. The other thought is when, for example, let's talk about the landscape ordinance, when that's completed and it has its black and white regulations, and it has its, headings for those regulations and sort of categories, perhaps those should be present in the design guidelines. So one of the problems we have, I think, and these 90 pages we were distributed today help remind us, is that, as everybody here pointed out on the dais, you see the same principles showing up, slightly phrased slightly differently, sometimes more strongly phrased, sometimes more weakly phrased, and it's very odd.
Yes.
Because sometimes you can find a principle that looks like it's optional, and then you follow it through and you get to the general plan and it's actually mandated.
Yeah.
You have no way of, and as you yourself, Brandon, said, it just makes life difficult for everybody. I wonder if we could tie these two documents together, the ordinance that Bernard and everyone will probably be working on, and the landscape portion of the design guidelines, by repeating the same headings from the zoning code over into the design guidelines. And then, as Nori said, teasing out the way you achieve that through illustrations, through examples, through qualitative language, and that's the role of the design guidelines. So I guess this is I'm tossing out this idea of that being the relationship where the design guidelines build on the landscape ordinance, just in terms of, maybe this is what you were saying, Brandon, like implementation ideas, ways that you could potentially meet it, examples, meet the requirements. Any reactions to that thought? You like that thought? Okay.
And this is all really good. Thank you, Madam Chair. This is all really good. This is the kind of feedback we're looking for as we go and start to work with our landscape consultant, because this, we're gonna, work with them, use their professional skills too. I mean, that's why we're contracting with a professional landscape architect who's done this type of thing before. They probably have some pretty good feedback too on how to make it most effective and interplay with design guidelines.
Yes, and I think the strength of having a designer involved goes again to Doug's point about the ability to envision the actual look and feel of what this is. And so that might end up informing, first of all, will make hopefully for very strong language in the ordinance, but also might feed into the illustrative qualities of the design guidelines. I would think that you might find, Brandon, as you go forward, that there stuff that a firm like Bernard's can contribute may end up in the design guidelines, because it really sort of helps expand our understanding of the regulations. Okay, and just to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty, again, on this same organizational topic, I know that this is item 4B, and I was putting it off, and we don't have to really get into it right now, but we did have this exercise that was an organizational exercise, and the only reason I'm bringing up during the landscape discussion is that when I went through the exercise and did my homework that I assigned myself, everybody else, I found that our favorite and most important principle that the group came up with, which was restore and enhance the forest in all improvement projects, private, public, and otherwise, had quite a bit of backup in the design guidelines, but from opposite ends of the design guidelines. Section 1 from the site planning concept guidelines was primarily reinforcing our forest desires, our forest principle, but also Section 10. So you had the two kind of parentheses of the entire design guidelines, one at the very beginning, one at the very end, and really those were all about the forest and landscaping. So the only reason I bring that up is that maybe it's just an example of all the things that we've been talking about, and it's evidence that this does need to be clarified. We do, and that something like restore and enhance the forest and all improvement projects does provide a fairly good umbrella for quite a bit of what we talk about in the rest of the guidelines and in fact possibly the zoning ordinance. So that was a revelation to me that we could gather stuff from the disparate parts of the guidelines and actually put it right under forest. Doug? Oh, no worries. So any other thoughts? So just to reiterate, I think pretty much everybody echoed what Mary Ann said about a kind of, because we've been talking at a very high level right now, which I think is very interesting. Mary Ann went to kind of a middle level when she first started talking, which was about solar access and making sure that that state regulation is considered. We had that, as I said, the attorney weighed in saying, what about landscape and views for other people when they're important views? Mary Ann mentioned that procession from the middle of the street into the from public to private. Anything else in that scale of thinking that springs to mind for folks? Or do we think, I think this is where I lean a little bit, that quite a bit of what is in that medium range of concepts or the subheading is actually here?
Yeah, right.
And so we're talking about a clarity problem, an organization problem that's pretty dire, but actually looking through this. So this is the question, is there anything missing? The solar ordinance thing I think has to be missing because that sounds like it's a new thing coming down. I do think the attorney was correct that that is missing, the idea of what respect. We're very good in the design guidelines about don't put your second and third, attic in front of somebody's window when they're looking at the ocean. Don't do that. But we don't talk about that with respect to foliage. I don't know if that's something we want to take up.
There's something in there.
Is there?
Yeah, there's. I cannot pinpoint it, but I distinctly remember that. Don't you? Views. Well, the views, but I'm talking about solar right now. Yeah. There's this distinct thing in there about solar, but see, that's the problem.
Yeah.
It's buried.
But is there anything else that you can think of that's not there, that's in the kind of to-do list, make sure it gets addressed kind of from a completely new standpoint because we haven't seen even a trace of it? I think probably the what do you call it, the landscape, the one that's at Public Works. Yeah. Brandon, what's that called again?
The forest management.
The forest management.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anything in there
well,
that
I'm sure there is.
That maybe needs to stay, obviously, in the forest management, but somehow ties over into concepts that a normal civilian would need to know to do a good job on their property.
I think we need to look at that because I think that there may be some discrepancies between what we're talking about and what we envision the goal of especially the forest aspect. The two main principles that we're talking about relate to the forest, the preservation, the restoration of issues relating to the trees, and then the enhancement. I think that we need to really solidify that, and we cannot do that without understanding what is in the forest management plan, because they're planting things that are diametrically opposed in some cases to what we perceive as the maintenance of the forest.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we give ourselves that homework?
Well, I will let me just offer though that the forest management plan is. I understand that there's a relationship between the trees and the houses. So this committee's focus is the design guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And that's residential architecture and the landscaping on a property. So the forest management plan is more about the overall forest health, as you're saying, making sure that that's not really, in my opinion, I don't think necessarily in the lane of this group. So I don't know if we want to assign ourselves a homework to dig into the forest management plan. I understand that there's a nexus between the landscaping stuff and the forest management plan, which we're going to work on with our landscape contractor as we start to dig into these, and rest assured there's going to be a draft that comes out, and we'll make sure that there's a relationship between the two. But for what it's worth, I would offer maybe we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of looking at the forest management plan and getting into that level of detail.
I'm just wondering personally if there is, my question to the group right now is there a item missing from the checklist?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, and I have not looked at the forest management plan. Let's say there's something in there that says, on private property, if a tree dies, you within X number of days do this. Maybe there's something that ought to be just like an item is a missing link, and not link, but a missing piece from that actually is design content.
So my suggestion would be if there's something in the design related regulations that you were handed out, if there's something that you see as missing, I'd love that feedback right now. And as we go off and work with our consultant, we're going to cross-reference the forest management plan, of course. And so if it shows up there, then we can answer the question right there. Okay, we don't need to add it because it exists here.
Right.
So the question today is more about, as the chair pointed out, what's missing. I don't know if we need to make a homework assignment to go and see what's missing out of the forest management plan.
Oh no, I meant what is missing from the design guidelines that might be your brain might be triggered by looking at the plan. It's not like I agree with you. We should not be looking at the forest management plan as something to be working on. Only the design guidelines. So what about for example, the native, non-native? What I read in the 90-some pages is that there's a percentage that shows up some places. Like try to make 75%, I think was a percentage somewhere, of plantings meet this qualification. I think it'd be interesting to just take an example. What would we do with that subtopic? Would it be something where we want to just say, no, really, we need in fact, I think Marian has said this before, she wants a plant list, right?
I think it's a good idea.
She wants a plant list, and she wants, I hate to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Marian, you can nod, you can thumbs up, you can thumbs down me. A plant list, and also she has suggested in the past a fence regulation that basically says if you're doing a fence, this is how you're going to do it. In other words, she wants to strengthen, or she has said in the past, she'd like to strengthen something that used to be a guideline into a regulation. And I think that's an interesting topic, and that's what Nori hinted at too. When something graduates to the point where it's so firm that it becomes not discretionary, then it goes into the zoning code.
Well, there are, to get back to my point, in the regulations, there are these things. It's all in this material here. All we have to do is have the time to pull it out. And I don't know, I think with the guidelines, at least how I perceive them, is the guidelines are relate to the visual compatibility between the policies and programs that we have, to put them in a place where the public finds them user-friendly, terse, concise, however you have the pictures to explain what those things mean. And I don't think the guidelines should be as discretionary to the point where you lose the whole meaning of what's going on. I mean, right now they're just too discretionary. I mean, what we want, as envisioned by this group and the public, is things that are supposed to be enforced. So ideas, principles that we find in all of the ordinances and policies need to be in one place, which should be the design guidelines, which is what the public can look at, and also what staff can look at. And instead of trying to find everything in the policies and ordinances, have them all visualized and tersely, concisely, there for everyone to see.
So let me ask you this, Melanie. I think there were no objections, and I think even Brandon might have been open to the idea of using the regulatory language once it is honed in, or even using the design guideline exercise that Nori's working on to cross-reference the zoning code and say, here's a principle that is maybe needs some work in the zoning code, we'll do that later, but ultimately we want these headings to be the same in both documents. And then when you go to the design guidelines, you see how to, examples and illustrations, et cetera. And then in the regulatory thing, you see the must, everything black and white. And that the two documents work much closer together. There's just the two. They just refer to one another, and that reference system is very clear. Did the four of us agree on that, and Marianne also? Is that something that is a tool that we think should be explored? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and I think Marianne, I'm not sure I don't have a screen anymore. My screen's blank.
I heard you. I have a little hard time not following you audibly, but exactly where you were headed.
Yeah, I mean, the whole conversation has been about the roles of these documents, and interestingly, it's the fact that we're about to do ordinance work with one topic, one of the 6 principles, which is the landscaping, that has brought up this issue of the relationship of the two documents. And I think it's actually very fruitful, because at some point ordinances will be updated and clarified, et cetera, for all these topics. Right now, we're working on the landscape ordinance. That's what the council has permitted us, or not, permitted the city to do. So, yes.
That would be a question to Brandon. Is it too radical of a thought of making the forest management plan or addressing the trees within the new landscape ordinance?
Well, that's kind of what...
Or landscape design guidelines, we could correctly call them.
Are you asking if you mean like rolling the landscape ordinance / guidelines into the forest management plan?
No, the opposite. Is it
The
too
opposite.
radical? Yeah, for the forest management
Because the
plan.
idea of extracting the trees from the landscape
Right,
and
it's just-
to have their own guidelines, that just makes no sense to me.
I agree, that's the point I was trying to get across, because we're talking about right-of-way, we're talking about front yards. We have in the ordinances requirement for tree replacement. We're talking about design for the property and what the site conditions are and what they should be in different spots. That's why I look at the design guidelines as the coming together of all of this stuff, but in a very simplified, very visually friendly document, instead of having the public have to go or the staff have to go and memorize. Well, it says about the trees and the landscaping in the front yards in this document, and then you have to go over to another document. What I'm trying to understand is if we shouldn't be thinking of the design guidelines as the place where you find everything referenced and tersely, concisely written, and with bullet points, somewhat like we had in our exercise, and try to proceed in that fashion. I mean, I'm pretty happy with a lot of what the city's already written and what is in existence. But
And the
I think-
regulations.
yeah, the regulations to me are by and large good, very good in many places. But they are not translated into a document that is friendly for the public and easily accessible also for the staff.
So let's get Marianne's question answered, because I think it relates to what you're saying, Melanie, and that is, would the staff be willing to consider, and would through this exercise with Bernard, taking the forest management, because it relates to the forest,
Yeah.
and getting it also consolidated into the regulations.
Well, it's a great suggestion, and we have already built into the scope that we're working on
Isn't that what I
to
said
have
10
early
minutes ago?
meetings with our Public Works Department and Forestry to talk about all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, this is already in our plan to explore and see where the nexus is between these documents, and if that's an outcome of that, as it makes sense to combine them, then
So this is
certainly.
happening parallel to potentially the work with Bernard Trainer's office? In other words, you're going to be you're working on the forest management plan on a separate related contract?
Yeah, so the Public Works Department has a contract with a different company working
Mm-hmm.
on the forest management plan. We're going to have a contract with a landscape architect to work on the landscape ordinance and whatever design documents go along with that. So in the work plan with our scope for our landscape architect is going to be early meetings with the Public Works Department, City Forester, their consultant is working on the forest management plan. So that's already built in.
Is the timing kind of
well.
parallel?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
So you can introduce these folks to each other and see if this team feels like.
Just remember though, we don't have a contract yet with
Right.
Ground Studios. You keep pointing to them, but
No, I know,
yeah,
but
okay.
whomever,
Yeah,
this team.
I know. I just want to be clear for the public
yes.
that we
I'd like
haven't
to
selected
ask,
anybody yet.
Brandon,
Don, go ahead.
is the forest management plan in the city website? Can we?
It should be, yeah. Yeah, I can find out. Like I
I'd
said,
certainly like to look at it, not that I want to change it, but.
Yeah, it lives outside of my purview, so I'll double check. You'd find it on the Public Works webpage, so but
Okay.
we can find
Yeah,
out.
appreciate that. If you can do that.
Brandon, thank you very much for that explanation,
course.
because that's what I was trying to get at 15 minutes ago.
Well, we'll get there. We'll get there eventually.
And if we're reviewing the right-of-way, and that's part of what we're all talking about and have been talking about for almost 9 months, that's why I have said repeatedly at other meetings and today that the forest management plan needs to be coordinated with all of this, because we're talking about the trees, and yet that's a different department. Well, there's got to be some symbiotic relationship between all of this stuff. It's got to come together. And my biggest concern, one of my biggest concerns, is the forest. If we lose the forest, this place is going to be just like any other coastal city in California.
So let me just get a confirmation of your thoughts, because I think the rest of the group agrees with you, and I think we're sending a pretty loud message as of today about the forest management plan. I think I'm going to look around for nods. I'm seeing Doug nodding. Don is very curious about the forest management plan. Again, no desire to, tweak the forest management plan on our parts, just the hope, the direction, if you will, to have these two processes coordinated with one another and potentially subordinate the forest management plan to or incorporate it into the regulations, so that it really is, again, more on the one-stop shopping kind of mentality. So I have so far two very kind of big picture, besides all the other comments that are from the five of us, that one, and then the sort of another crossover point, which is to use the regulatory language as a helper for the design guidelines. And I'm glad you brought up, Melanie, the right-of-way vision statement, because we've all been puzzling. We don't know when it was written. I still don't.
I did find out.
Oh, you found out?
Yeah, I've been messaging with our Public Works Director. So it was adopted in 1997.
1997.
So it's very old.
And we don't have a sense of, I mean, this is a random document to me.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know it existed.
Yeah, and there's apparently some supporting visual documents with that as well.
So it
I've
would.
also just, sorry to interrupt.
No, go
I also
ahead.
was just double checking. So the Forest Management Plan was adopted in December of 2000, and it does live on the Public Works Forestry webpage, Forest Parks and Beach webpage, so that's all there.
Okay, thank you for that. We will now know where to find it. I think it's useful to know, like, this is so bizarre in a way. Right-of-way vision statement. Why do we have a right-of-way vision statement? Why don't we have a Carmel vision statement? Why don't we have a private property vision statement? Why don't we have a street asphalt vision statement? it's a little bit random. If I understood the use of this, I might think we need to either incorporate this into another document, or we need to have 50 of these for all of the things that we have visions for. So the fact that we have one vision statement about the right-of-way is very confusing to me. So, to Brandon, does this help you? Does this help to have a statement? Do you want vision statements? Do you want them to
No.
be part of a document? You don't need this.
No, I don't. It's just something, I mean, this is 1997, that's 20, 30 years, 27 years old. So no, I think that if I think we have a vision and a purpose for what this committee is doing. You know, that was set out 8, 9, 10 months ago when the city council adopted the contract with Nori, and we know what we're doing. I don't think we need, if you're asking if I think we need to start developing vision statements for.
No, it was a joke, but
Yeah.
I'm just wondering,
Okay, not a
this
good joke.
information,
Yeah.
what I'm asking is the content of this
Yeah, so
is
that, the
important.
content of that is helpful because
Yes.
the reason I included it, because it, along with the other documents that I included, speak to what the people that wrote these documents envisioned, I need to take that word, envisioned before. So as we're working with our landscape architect to talk about, you know, the different zones, more or less, you've got the right-of-way, which is public. We've got the 15 feet the front of someone's house. You've got the side. You've got the back. What was the vision?
At the curb, you got
for
the
these
asphalt.
things? Yeah,
Yes.
which occur in the public area that I talked about at the beginning.
So this, I just want to make sure that we agree that we don't need to lose this information, but again, we need to organize it properly within the other documents.
Right, and how can you have a right-of-way statement that does not address the trees? I mean, you read this thing and it's really good, you know? It reinforces other things in the ordinances, but, excuse me, number one should be something about the preservation and restoration enhancement of the forest, because right now, a lot of the forest is just street trees.
But it looks like we're eliminating this entirely.
Yeah, but
So-
some of the ideas.
but the ideas, right, need to carry
The ideas in
through.
it are good, because they, you know, they clarify and synthesize a
Oh,
lot of
Marianne
what's in other documents.
Marion has her hand up. I don't have a screen that's operating, so I'm sorry, I can't tell who wants to
Oh,
speak at any
yeah,
given point.
Marianne-
I don't know how
Marianne
long.
wants to talk at some
Okay.
point.
Melanie, are you ceding the floor to Marianne?
Sure.
Okay. Marianne.
I just learned something new, Brandon. I think I heard you correctly say that the Public Works Department is writing or working on the forest management plan.
Yeah, that's correct.
Isn't that a very unique situation? Shouldn't all the planning be done by the planning department?
No, because I appreciate that sentiment, and it makes me feel good about how much faith you have in the planning department. But a forest management plan is a technical document that's overseen by, the city forester, people who have licenses and degrees in forestry. So maybe after if you guys want to take a look at the forest management plan, you can see what it is, because it is more of a technical document about trees and the health of the forest and things like that. I mean, I'm not discounting what you said, because like I mentioned, we're working with them. You know, anytime we work on something, for example, like the design guidelines, we've had meetings with our public works department as we've been working on this design guidelines project for the last 8 or 9 months, because there is that interrelation between departments. But as far as a forest management plan goes, the lead is the city forester, the technical forestry expert who has the licenses, degrees, and certifications to manage a forest.
Doug has a comment. Yeah.
Well, I have a comment from my colleagues, and I don't want to get Brandon involved in this. Has the community reached a point where organizationally the city forester should report to the director of planning and building?
I think that would be important.
I think.
I fully agree. Yeah.
Tell me what inspires you to make that comment, Doug.
Well, you look at the documents we have, and they're all at some point in time tied in to development and planning or redevelopment. And yet you have this ancillary operation out here, which is responsible for the forest. And that person doesn't report to who's responsible for what's happening on properties.
Exactly. I agree with you.
I'll tell you one story to enforce your opinion there, and that is that when I was, I think, on the council, there was a curb installed between the gate of Pebble Beach toward 4th Avenue. And I think it was mostly me and Ken Talmadge were freaking out because that curb did not follow, and still doesn't, follow the design standards for public works. Instead of putting a river rock embedded, I think it's sort of a combination of concrete and river rock is the standard. Instead, they did a very large industrial asphalt, sharp-edged, not even rolled. It completely defied all of our. We never knew how that happened, and we were very puzzled. Why didn't this come to the Planning Commission if it was something that was going to diverge so far from what how is it that we have these standards and then things get built that are there for quite a bit of time that are not even close to what we agree on? So we did have a large conversation about enforcement and hierarchy and how these decisions, whether the public should have seen that if it was going to be so crazy, and we never really resolved it. But it speaks to your point that these are visual issues that we care deeply about, and we put in this town, we put the responsibility for that in the Planning Commission and in the staff that oversees the Planning Commission. So I think that supports that argument. What do you think, Don?
You're getting close to the elephant in the room,
Oh.
which is the city's activities or non-activities.
Right.
And we talk about all these good things, and then you see these
Aberrations.
tree pockets paved over. And I've just raised hell about that, and the answer is, of course, utilities. Doug has an answer to that. They're alternatives. Private developers complaining. So how do we implement the things we're all talking about when the city itself is
Not going to enforce them.
it is not following suit?
Well, it's possible that one answer is this theme of integration that we've been harping on this entire time, and that really this is the key thing that we have been discovering as a committee over the course of these months is this integration, organization, and simplification of access. Go ahead, Doug.
So let me amplify about the forester reporting to the Director of Planning and Building. The R1 design standards, the very first item, purpose, talks about the urban forest.
Right.
The very first item.
Yeah.
The second item talks about neighborhood design. In the landscape section, 1734 talks about the preliminary site plan. That's a development application. The item under that is forest enhancement.
Yeah. That's what I keep saying. We have all of this in a fragmented situation, and all we have to do, it seems to me, is go through this stuff and pull it together.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just realized, I know that I talk a lot because I'm organizing the conversation, but you all have stimulated, I never weighed in on things I thought might be missing, and this discussion is making me think of some things. And a long time ago, Marianne brought up the notion that we should require projects to have landscape architects. That's a topic for you to consider, team that is developing this landscape ordinance. Whether or not we require a landscape architect to be engaged, it's along the lines of the same level of information. Should we have native plants? To what percentage? Should we have a landscape architect? And similarly, one other thought on that scale is often when I read through these documents and when I was on the commission and the council, I thought, gosh, there really is a lot here about trees and site planning and respect for siting the building, and that's always out in front. You need to do this first. And I felt as a commissioner, and that could have changed now, I have no idea, that I never saw that level of scrutiny about the site. that it wasn't foregrounded like we as a group would like it to be foregrounded now. So my second contribution to the list is whether we should require and when a full landscape plan. In other words, it appears to me, I know that we require it and that it becomes part of a submission to an application, but perhaps it should be, the sequence of it should be changed around. In other words, when you start evaluating your site, you produce a vision as an applicant for your landscaping that is has much of an emphasis or possibly a prior, a dominant emphasis to the building. It's not trying to screen icky styles nothing like that, but just that the forest comes first. So those are my two things about sort of the middle scale missing pieces.
Can I just make some comments here?
Mm-hmm.
On the landscape, ordinance, one thing that strikes me constantly, and it's an embellishment on what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
It says, all new development or substantial alteration of existing development shall require submittal and approval of a forest enhancement and management plan and a landscape plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's right here. All we have to do is
Mm-hmm.
say that there, you've got a designer, an architect, and you have their plans. Why not the same thing and require a landscape architect? I mean, it's, and then you go down here and there's just a lot of really good information in here and requirements and support for everything that we're saying. I'm thinking that a landscape architect, Brandon, rather than just having the design architect do stuff, if we had a landscape architect, the landscape architect is going to read what the city requires. Right now, probably nobody's reading all the stuff that the city requires when we do site plans for properties. This would, if you read all of this just on the first page, it says applicants shall submit a forest enhancement and maintenance plan. Does anybody do that anymore?
Yeah, it's a condition of approval on projects.
Yeah.
Well, then where are we falling apart? I mean, I don't understand why everything doesn't look
Like it had a plan submitted.
Like it had a plan submitted and it had a plan approved.
So,
Well, think about what we're talking about, though. The guidelines don't say what has to be in that plan. That's really where that's the crux of this project, is the work that we're going to do with a landscape architect is to develop the ordinance and the guidelines to be more robust, so people know what they're supposed to give us in those plans.
and
That's really, I think, where the disconnect is.
And Brandon, would you say that, I mean, I knew you were going to say that of course they submitted already. I
Yeah.
could have answered that for you. I knew Brandon would say he's of course checking that box and it's happening. The question is, do you think it's happening, Brandon, in such a way that foregrounds the importance of the forest, the way that this body and the public have made clear?
No, I don't think so. And the reason for that is because, like we have the design guidelines, think architecturally. They have a lot of really good guidance of what an application has to submit to meet those guidelines. What's the test, basically? What are the findings you need to make to approve something? The landscaping, and this is something we identified early on, is weak. It doesn't have that. So that's the whole purpose of this exercise that the city's going to undertake for a landscape architect, is to make that more robust so we can make findings and we can look at a landscape plan and say, this doesn't do that. So that's, I mean, we're hitting on the sort of like the biggest issue at hand with this right now.
Do you think, Brandon, there's a role for the Forest and Beach Commission to be part of the approval of an application as a way to, again, foreground? So, for example, let's say an applicant is starting to work on their property. They're being required now by the city to have a robust, more particular landscape approach. This is a total neophyte question. Would it be useful to say, listen, we care about this so much that you need to, prior to coming to the Planning Commission, take your planting vision to the Forest and Beach Commission? What do you
In
think?
some cases, they have to when there's trees involved. So there's
Sure.
certain triggers already in the code that they're already going to. My initial gut answer is probably not, because we're developing guidelines that are sort of keyed in and locked to the design guidelines that the Planning Commission and staff are using to evaluate the overall development. And so those guidelines should be instructive of whether or not the landscaping meets the test too. I mean, that's really the goal of this. I don't think we need to bifurcate those two to different bodies, or if it's, there's a design review board that we come up with or whatever. Whoever's doing that review of the overall project design should have enough tools to decide if the landscaping beats the bill.
Okay.
The trees is a whole nother thing. The size of a tree being cut down or removed, that's the purview, like regulatory purview of the Forest and Beach Commission.
Okay.
So that stuff goes to them. But as far as like the landscape design, I think that can stay with the development.
Don has
I'd
a
like
comment.
to comment that, yes, I agree that we've got to be careful we're not making things so burdensome
Yeah.
that I don't think you need a landscape architect. You need the strict rules of what the landscaping plan should do. I don't think a landscape architect is a silver bullet.
Okay.
So it's a matter of having such clear things, guidelines, rules, that it's incorporated in any submittal.
And I guess what I'm searching for here is a way to foreground, because this committee and the public have been so clear on foregrounding, repositioning the forest as the primary first level concern. And I don't know, for a group of architects usually, sometimes on the commission, or people who have been accustomed to thinking about the structure only, what do you think, Brandon? Are there any thoughts about how you make clear the importance of that we could add to the process?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a level of input that I was looking for today. What should the landscape ordinance accomplish? That's the first question I put down here. And if the response from the committee is, it should make sure that people understand that the foreground of their property is very important. I mean, that's all I need, honestly. And then I can work with our landscape architect that we bring on board in the designing to make sure that that's front and center in whatever regulations we put together. And you can't get past go unless you accomplish that goal.
So I guess I have a two-part question. Is the content we've agreed we all have agreed, including you, Brandon, and Nora, needs to just be firmed up. It's inadequate. It's weaker than everything else. You've made that clear. I guess my sub-question is, what about the process? I threw out the Forest and Beach thing. I don't care if that's not a good idea. But is there something else in the process that would make clear to an applicant, by the way, there's these super strict things, and it's going to be the first thing we check when you come in, or something?
I don't want to get too far into deciding how the process works, and I wouldn't say it would be the first thing, but we have application checklists that have, here are the things that are important. And right now the application checklist is basically just, you need to submit a landscape plan, but it doesn't say why it's important. It doesn't say here's what needs to be on the landscape plan. So that's what will change.
Okay.
I think as much as we can, it should remain part of the overall, I was giving the analogy earlier of being like, dovetailed in. It should remain part of the overall development review.
Okay.
We're not trying to separate out its own review process. It has standards that whoever's doing the review, whether it's staff or planning commission, can look at the whole guideline package and say, okay, I'm going to look at landscaping now. When I'm doing my landscaping review, I'm going to go to this section. It passes or it doesn't pass. Okay. Now I'm going to look at, the house itself. Here's the section. Does it pass or doesn't pass?
Okay. Good. All right. Let's. You might have some final thoughts, because I would like to, before it's almost 2 hours, I'd like to just make plans for what we're going to do next.
Yeah.
Because we probably have to continue. But keep going.
Brian, I think.
Brandon,
excuse me. I don't know where that came from.
Yes, Marcy?
Brandon, yeah, going way back. In the process of doing that check that the department's going to do, is at that point, when someone's reviewing the landscape plan as a hypothetical, are they going to have like a checklist of what the most important things are for them to ensure that the site plan is what we want whenever we totally define.
When you say they,
all
do you
of
mean
that.
like the staff or the?
Yeah, so that the staff, so that the staff knows what they're expected to.
Yeah. Well, that is
The
the
whole
zoning
idea
code.
is that-
That's so.
yeah, the
I'll
checklist.
I'll just give. I mean, just really briefly. So the way, and I would encourage you, if you haven't read one recently, to read a planning commission staff report or watch a planning
Yeah.
commission meeting, because the way we lay out our reports and our analysis to the planning commission, or when we do staff level approvals, what we write up, it goes through section by section where it's relevant to a project of the design guidelines, if there's something that's consistent or inconsistent. And so that's what we do. We have checklists for applicants, what we need submitted, and we have some tools that we use, but really the way we review a project in planning is you get a project in and you just go through the applicable sections of the zoning code when you're looking at the review to see if it meets the test. So in a sense, the zoning code and the regulations we're creating are the checklist.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Could I ask Brandon a couple questions?
Yes,
And
go for it.
I'm pursuing this topic because it's going to be timely. Would you see advantages to having the city forester as a division of your department?
Oh, Doug, I'm not going to answer that question.
Pardon me?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay. Do you see any
No,
disadvantages?
I think there's, I don't want to get into advantages or disadvantages, but, I appreciate the sentiment. I have worked other places where the decisions on trees do fall under a planning department. A disadvantage I would see is that the forestry department in Carmel-by-the-Sea is also a technical tree crew. So the folks that go up into the trees, actual tree climbers and cutters, those are managed by the city forester. So there's a public works aspect, a true raw public works aspect of forestry in the city, because we do our own tree work. We don't just contract it out. So that's where there maybe the overlap departs a little bit on the forestry. There are absolutely aspects of the forestry department, a lot of what you see at like the Forest and Beach Commission, the design stuff and an application to remove a tree for a forthcoming development project. There is a disconnect there right now. We're trying to help with that because you have one body who's deciding that a tree can be removed for development, but the development isn't being reviewed at the same time by the people who approve the development. So if the Planning Commission reviews a development and says, well, we want you to change the design, and if that design being changed would have saved a tree, now you've got approval for a tree removal so I recognize that, and we're trying to figure out ways to plug that hole because the process has problems. But, I've seen it done multiple ways. I'm trying to dance around actually saying like yes or no, it should be moved to the community planning and building department because it's not really my call. But I think there's pros and cons to the approach, honestly. And there is that really obvious division where you've got the folks that are up in trees running chainsaws doing a public works activity versus the sort of call it forest design and caretaking that a forester also does. So it's almost like you've got two divisions within one in a way.
Nobody wants you to make a call here at the dais, but I think it's useful for you to help us understand at least your own opinion of how things can work and
I think it could work both ways, honestly. But
the reason for bringing it up now is the city's going to start a recruitment, I imagine, fairly soon for a city forester.
Yeah.
So if there was going to be consideration of a change, now would be the time to suggest that.
Oh, we're losing the city forester?
The city forester
She
is
resigned.
leaving.
Yeah.
She did.
Oh,
So
Maybe in our last few minutes, unless Doug, you have other follow-up thoughts, or anyone else, I wonder if Bernard could just come up and have his thoughts or any other questions he might have of us, having sat here and listened to all this diligently. Bernard, do you mind coming up and just saying hi? And then, if you have any, I'm sure that this is not the most completely organized chat, but we're trying to get at.
I'm used to unorganized. Thanks for your service. It's pretty incredible to come here and see just people who care so much. It's really admirable. And we feel the same way, like that's why we're here today. We love Carmel. We'd love to be involved in the process. We've had some great discussions with Brandon, and I've got Johnson, Bullard, and David Leroy, 2 owners in Ground Studio. It's not just me, there's 25 others. They do all the work. But I think to summarize, there was so many great thoughts, but I think it just kept coming back to the same thing with me, which was I kept hearing it's unclear, it's disorganized, it's not user-friendly, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just trying to think on one of our regular projects, if I went to a client and approached them that way and showed them, here's what I think about the landscape. I'm going to show you something unclear, disorganized, and generally won't work, but pay me. So if I simplify, I go, well, all right, we're applying that to a larger thing, which is the general public, or the neophiles, as you term them, which I thought was a good way to think of it. Just like, who's coming to the town, and what's the most succinct, I heard that word a lot too, what's the most succinct way of giving them the best opportunity to have tools at hand to make good decisions, no matter what their architecture style, no matter what their fence likes. I mean, that'll all be regulated. But like, I think it's not user-friendly to just for it to be an ordinance. I just think that's gonna not serve, I mean, we will get to that part, but I feel like the design guidelines are gonna be the very user-friendly material. And I kept thinking about scale, because we kept going, it was like we were dancing with one person and then we were dating 25 others and trying to figure out who we wanted to marry. Because it was like, we're talking about the house, the front yard, the 2 side yards, the backyard, and then we're in the right-of-way, and then we're talking about a streetscape, and then I just kept drawing these concentric rings, going, we're really talking about a forest and the natural history of a landscape that has a very interesting cultural history of the people who came here and the way they treated and revered that landscape. And I think we just need to get back to that. Not everybody is going to conform with every rule. It's just the way it's going to go. So what is our best chance at the greater good happening for this incredible natural and cultural history of Carmel? So I think it needs a total refresh, and it needs some really big thoughts. I think, Nancy, you kept saying there's really good materials in there. We don't want to throw anything away. When somebody
Melanie.
said, like,
Melanie.
Oh, Melanie.
Sorry, we didn't introduce ourselves.
Yeah,
That's our fault.
and Doug, correct, too, as
Yes.
well. All right.
Don. You know Don.
Yeah, I know Don, I know Marianne. I think we need to let whoever the person is working on this project, they've got to evaluate everything, because there's some gold in there. It could be one sentence. We just need to evaluate everything, bring it together in a cohesive way, very usable way. And then you were also talking about, as I said, some bigger thoughts on streetscape and downtown. We'll have to really figure out the scope of work to make it as cohesive as possible, but also, so not diluting something down to, we did a little bit everywhere, let's do everything well, and I don't know if we're doing it all at once or not.
Well, we are here, obviously, all of us, including the public, as a resource should you go on with the project, and we're happy that you're here today to listen, and hopefully that wasn't too incredibly confusing.
No, it's incredibly exciting. I think our role is to do just what you asked for, is not make it unclear, make it user-friendly, give people the best chance at introducing them to what's the principles are here. So getting back to what we've already started, people have done it for us. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, and I think we could do something really foundational that could be adjusted as we go instead of rewriting it 10 years from now.
Yeah, that's another aspect that we haven't really touched on, is just malleability and adaptability going forward. That's a good principle to bring up, Bernard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here.
Okay, terrific. So we just, from a housekeeping standpoint, we got through 4A, I would say. We have 4B, we have 5, we have 6 and 7. So we had this organizational exercise, which turned out to have some relevance to our discussion, but I still think we should follow up with that. And then we have no time to go through the minutes that staff finally provided us, that whatever other work updates. And so I propose, if there's no objections, that we continue the meeting. Because we had Marianne here for the landscaping thing, I feel less pressure not that I'm trying to exclude her, of course, but
She's gone, so she won't.
no, she won't know.
Yeah.
But no, that when if she wants to and can be here for the rest of the agenda, that would be great. But if not, I don't think at least we've got her for the part we wanted her for most. So continuing the meeting, Brandon, tell me about the logistics of that from your end.
I would just, unless everyone has access to their calendars this moment and we want to do it right now, I would just do what I've been doing and reach out to everyone and find a date when they all line up.
Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
Time and date?
Try to do it here in the next
TBD?
week or so.
Yeah.
Just to keep the momentum from
Is
this
that okay,
meeting.
Don?
I'm wondering, the clock is ticking in
Yes.
North contract. When do we get the proposed draft of the guidelines?
Really soon, and that's that's actually an agenda item on today's meeting that we're continuing. So I'll look to the chair and see if we want to dig into that at all, or.
Well, my thought just coming up is that since we might be, as you say, very soon about to get that, and if we receive an update on the consultant and we're continuing the meeting, then maybe that will be part of item 5 and we work out the schedule so that you can include that.
Yeah.
Would that be a possibility?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's another benefit to continuing the meeting, is it gives them a little more time to round out item 5.
Yeah,
and update.
I'm not trying to be coy about it. It's weeks, not months, though, for a draft to come out. That I'll say for sure.
I thought we were saying more days than weeks.
Yeah.
Wasn't it weeks a few weeks ago?
Yeah.
So I'm just asking, is it possible if we continue the meeting that we could get that?
It's possible. Yeah, I mean, it could be as little as a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we get it as soon as possible, because, I mean, we have to have time to look at it, and I don't want it to land up like the strategy plan where we think we're going to see the synthesis of everything we've done before it goes to the council, and it goes to the council before we've, have a feeling that we've really had an opportunity to see our recommendations and staff recommendations, and a final draft before it goes to the city. I think because we're on such a tight timeline, Brandon, the sooner that you can get Nori's stuff to us, the better we're going to be able to review. And I think that's what Don's concern was.
Yeah,
it certainly is my concern.
I mean, we've kind of tipped into it, so I'll just go a little bit farther. So the city has a staff level rough working draft that we've been going back and forth with Nori on. So we did get something from him. It's just not ready for public release because it's really unorganized. It's more thought based. So that we're going to have a cleaner draft version that we can send out here in the next week or so. And so the vision for the next month and a half is steering committee gets the draft, we get some feedback. We're going to have our next community meeting, so community meeting number 4, sometimes towards the end of February, to also get feedback from the community on the draft, and then we'll go Planning Commission, City Council for feedback on that draft. So we're going to be, basically the next month and a half is going to be rolling out the draft and getting feedback from steering committee, community, city council, and planning commission. So we're at that point. It's really exciting. I know you're excited to get it, and you will very soon, I promise.
Okay.
And the comment that came out of today unanimously from the group about the crossover with the regulatory language may be part of your prep for public consumption.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
I think that
would be good.
That would be good to see that kind of in real time. Well, wonderful. Okay, so we're continuing to TBD for exact date and time, and so I am not adjourning the meeting, but go ahead, Melanie, before I don't adjourn it.
Yeah, just, Brandon, if we could have the next meeting as soon as possible to get through this. I think if we put it off for a whole week, I mean, all of this takes away from our time to be able to keep up with what's going on. And if we have too much all at one meeting, and we're not able to get it done, then we have continuation, which in this case is not a problem. But if we have to wait a week before we get back to it, our thoughts and other things interfere with our ability to really get this exercise done in a thoughtful
I hear what you're saying, Melanie. I mean, just, keep in mind, we've got our city council strategic retreat next Tuesday that all
no, I
departments are
know that.
working on. So
Yeah.
I understand a week maybe feel like a long time, but we'll get it within the week, hopefully. And it's going to be dependent on all of your schedules too. So as I reach out to everyone, hopefully we
Yeah.
can find a slot that lines up for
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
But I hear you. I do hear you that the time is of the essence here.
Okay. All right, so we're continuing the meeting to a time to be decided. Thank you, everybody, so much for
Thank you.
all your alert listening and contributions. Till next time.
Thank you.